9. The Germans have an expression, einmal ist keinmal. Once is the same as never. And this expression has already come up when I was talking about the gigantomachy and the idea of the West in Heidegger. When Heidegger sees himself repeating Plato and Aristotle, he's doing a common gesture that we talk about in terms of the idea of the West, not just in philosophy, but in history more broadly. But of course, even if there was something specific or distinctive about the Greek project, there was no sense in which they saw this as part of some Western project. That's a later invention. And so the repetition is only possible once the initial project has taken place. We're going to see something similar here when I'm using these words history and mythology of being. The Greek words here, historia and mythos, actually overlap a lot. Both of them have to do with the idea of a story. I'm not saying that history and myth are the same thing, but there's going to be a lot of overlap. For example, a lot of the myths that we have in the ancient world come from Herodotus, who's also known as the father of history. Now, even though he wasn't a poet, he was also known as the father of lies. But the point is that in his history, he's constantly referring to and using myth. And there's a lot of ways in which he's trying to cast his entire story, his entire historia, as something like an epic poem, sort of self-consciously in a certain genre. Now, of course, that's only partially related to how we use these terms today.
Okay.
When Heidegger is doing his history of being, he is very self-consciously reenacting this gigantomachy, right? That Plato was using as a rhetorical trope, but that Heidegger is now taking seriously as a heuristic to understand the history of ontology, but also the history of the West. And the point, when I'm saying that we're not taking the mythology seriously enough in this context, I think that there's a lot of side roads, other paths, weird things that happen, that ways in which what Heidegger's calling the question of being becomes not more answered, but more decisively questionable, that are being undersold in the name of constructing a coherent history. But coherence in that sense, and sort of simply focusing on origins or on a specific group, have never been what's going on in the kinds of stories that we call myths. So to take seriously a mythology of being in Heidegger is going to be to look at the ways in which there's a story taking place here that has a lot of dead ends, twists and turns, side roads that don't always lead into a sort of a neat or coherent direction, but that end up being decisive for the way in which history unfolds. Now, even if that means that Heidegger is going to defend something like a history of the West, and it's a very different West than the West that his liberal critics want to defend, but who are also in a lot of ways committed to a defense of the history of the West, what we're going to see here instead is something like a gigantomachy, the way in which this history emerges as a struggle without necessarily taking any sides in the struggle. Or without necessarily, taking any sides is an interesting question, and it's one that I will have to come back to, but without presuming the victory of, the rightness of, the morality of one side or another in the struggle, simply noticing the way in which the struggle unfolds. But in order to do that, we're going to have to clear aside some presuppositions that have gotten in the way of us even seeing, let's say, this mythical character at all. And that's what we're going to start to do as we move into section 1 of Being in Time, which we're finally ready to start reading.